Chapter 2 The General's Enemies. Chet Morgan grinned as he handed the battered camera to Joe. On the front mount was a telescopic lens. "I got a telephoto snapshot," Chet boasted. "Are you sure?" Joe eyed the camera skeptically. "Where'd you get this?" "At a pawn shop," Chet exclaimed. "Just because it's second-hand doesn't mean it's junky." Joe examined the camera. The lens seemed to be good enough, but the camera body had been cracked, and it was patched here and there. "I hope it hasn't any light leaks," Joe said, handing the camera back to Chet. "I'd sure like to have a picture of that man." "Count on me," Chet said, as the two boys drove toward the Hardy home to develop the picture. "You fellows working on a mystery?" Chet's voice contained a note of apprehension. The Hardy boys were his closest friends, and though Chet greatly enjoyed their companionship, he was always loath to participate in the risks that they ran. "I don't know yet," Joe replied, and explained hurriedly about the mysterious phone calls. At the house, Frank met them at the door. "Did you find Dr. Bush?" he whispered excitedly. Joe shook his head, and then Frank explained in low tones that the man had ended their telephone conversation very abruptly. After hastily introducing Chet to General Smith, Joe ushered his friend into the basement, where the Hardy boys had their darkroom. "You'll find Developer and Hypo under the bench, Chet. I hope the picture's good." While Chet was busy removing the film from the old camera, Joe rejoined his brother and the General Smith. "I must say," the General commented, "that you boys sure dash around." Frank apologized for the interruption and explained. "Our friend Chet's a photographer, and he uses our equipment sometimes. Please go on with your story about the Civil War, General Smith." "Well, when my great-grandfather, as well as my grandfather, failed to clear up the mystery, my father took a hand, because the Beauregard-Smith branch of the family still blame us for the loss of their fortune." Frank and Joe sat tensely on the edge of their chairs listening. "My father was a general, too," their caller said. "The military tradition in the Smith family has been our pride for over a century. That's why I'm so determined to find the treasure." General Smith thumped the table beside him so hard that the lamp on it teetered precariously. He jumped from his chair and began again to pace the room. The boys looked at each other in alarm. Seating himself, the general continued. "After exhaustive work, my father was able to unearth the fact that the bandolier had been stolen by a spy. Long after the war, when there was no longer need for secrecy, the story came out that an enemy soldier named Charles Bingham had entered my great-grandfather's camp. He was seen during the battle, but later was reported missing." "And the secret of the buried gold went with him?" Joe inquired excitedly. "That's right," the general answered. "You want Dad to help you find the hidden gold?" Frank assumed. "The only clue is Bingham, and you don't know what happened to him." General Smith nodded. "I know it'll be hard, but I have a lot of faith in your father's reputation." "Dad's the best detective in this part of the country," Joe said. "You came to the right man. But Dad will want proof of your story before—" The look which flashed across the general's face was ample evidence that Joe had said the wrong thing. "Proof?" the man sputtered. His red hair fairly bristled. "General Smith," Frank said, "my brother meant no offense. After all, we haven't seen your credentials." "Credentials?" the general shouted. Suddenly the cracking atmosphere was interrupted by the click of a key, and the front door swung open. In strode Fenton Hardy. "Dad!" Frank exclaimed, hurrying towards the tall, broad-shouldered detective. "Boy, are we glad to see you!" Joe cried out. As Fenton Hardy entered the living room, General Smith made a sudden move toward him. "Fent Hardy!" he boomed. To Frank and Joe's amazement, their father stood stock still a moment, and then put out his hand, exclaiming, "Jack Smith!" Frank and Joe stared wide-eyed as their father and General Smith exchanged greetings. As soon as he could, Joe took his father aside and whispered, Dad, we were told the General is insane." The boy quickly related what had happened. The detective, recovering from the shock of the announcement, pondered for a second. Then he laughed heartily and put his arm around his son. "Tell General Smith what you just told me, Joe." Upon hearing the insanity story, General Smith threw back his head and laughed heartily. "It only goes to show you can't tell who's crazy. I've thought ever since I came in here, Fenton, that your sons were acting rather peculiarly." Grinning like a couple of boys, Mr. Hardy and General Smith recalled the happy days that they'd spent together one summer in an officers' training camp. Frank turned to the General finally. "General Smith, have you any idea who Dr. Bush and the woman caller might be?" "Not the faintest," General Smith answered, a worried frown creasing his forehead. "My guess is," Mr. Hardy spoke up, "that Bush is no doctor and he's using a fake name." He turned to the General. "Did you tell anybody you were going to visit me?" "Not a soul." "Did you make a memorandum that something or someone might have seen?" "No, the only thing I did was write the letter." "Letter?" "Yes. Don't tell me you didn't get it." The General said that, as he made a quick trip down to Centersville, the town nearest the old Beauregard Smith plantation, while there he'd discovered that someone had been digging secretly on the property. At once he'd decided to enlist Fenton Hardy's help, and had written him a letter. Then somebody intercepted the mail, Mr. Hardy surmised, and learned that you were coming here. The detective asked General Smith for a resume of the strange story of the missing bandolier. While he was telling it, Frank and Joe went to the darkroom to see Chet. They found him gazing at a wet print. "Hey, this is only half a picture," Joe exclaimed, peering at it. "Nothing but the doctor's legs and a black bag." Chet was crestfallen. His telephoto camera had failed him. "I guess I'll just tear this up and start all over again," he said glumly. "Don't do that," Frank interrupted. "This might prove to be a valuable clue." Chet went back to work on the rest of the film, and Frank and Joe returned upstairs. Mr. Hardy and the General were discussing the mystery. Their Aunt Gertrude, Mr. Hardy's spinster sister who lived with them, had come in and heard the story. "No good will come of this," the boys heard her prophesy as they entered the living room. "The minute I heard the warning was involved." "Now, Gertrude," Mr. Hardy spoke up, trying to calm her. "We've dealt with mysterious phone calls before." "That woman means big trouble," said his sister, who was apt to jump to conclusions. "And as for that doctor—" "Oh, my pie's burning!" She rushed from the room. "What I'm afraid of," General Smith said, "is that the secret message in the old bandolier has been found, and some criminal knows where to look for the gold." Mr. Hardy set his friend's mind at rest on this score. "It's possible that the message has been found, but the gold cache, if it had been located, well, Dr. Bush wouldn't be on your trail." "If he's a crook, he probably has a criminal record," Frank suggested. "Well, that's logical thinking," his father said. "We'll go to my study and take a look at the pictures in my rogues gallery. Jack, you may recognize someone you've seen in Centerville. Maybe it'll give us a clue." The four trooped to the second floor. The detective spread dozens of pictures over his desk. The General scanned each one carefully, but concluded that he'd never seen any of the shady characters. "I must get back to the hotel now," he said. "It's been—" The words were lost as a shrill shriek sounded from downstairs. "Aunt Gertrude!" Frank and Joe leapt to their feet and bounded down the stairs. To their amazement, they saw their aunt grappling with two men at the front door, with her eyeglasses dangling wildly over one ear. Miss Hardy clutched one man by the hair and tugged at the other's necktie. "You can't come in here, you ruffians!" she cried, blocking them. "Help! Help!" "Hold them, Aunt Gertrude!" Joe shouted. And then the men spied the reinforcements. The thugs, whose faces were screened by the melee of arms, wrenched loose and dashed into the street with the boys close behind. End of Chapter 2.